Just gone 6 o'clock on the 5th of February 2020. It's Ben and Sonia with you until 9. Coming up this morning,
ending the early release of counter-terrorism offenders. It's right that these individuals are kept behind bars, and we need to stop their early release from prison.
New powers will be used to keep terror offenders behind bars. Later, we'll talk about what's happening in our prisons to tackle terrorism. How do we stop those convicted offences coming back onto the streets to cause harm again? We will discuss what's going wrong in the prison system next.
With Sonia Watson and Ben Fryer. This is BBC Essex.
Good morning. Now, we started the week talking about the terrible scenes witnessed in South London when a man who'd just been released from prison stabbed people on what would have been a quiet Sunday afternoon. It comes as two other attacks have been taken place by people only recently released from prison for terror offences.
Yesterday, the Justice Secretary Robert Buckland told MPs that emergency legislation will be introduced to end the automatic early release from prison of terror offenders, which is something you called for on Monday's show. They'll now only be considered for release once they've served 2/3 of their sentence and with the approval of the parole board. But what's going wrong in prison to lead to those convicted of terror offences to come out and maim and kill again? We're going to chat to the former Deputy Governor of Chelmsford Prison shortly. But first, let's chat to Sidra Naeem, is a chaplain at Chelmsford College and has received training on spotting the signs of radicalisation. Thanks for coming in this morning, Sidra.
Thank you very much.
What is going wrong here when it comes to these who have the beliefs on their release from prison?
I personally feel that when people are sentenced and go to prison, there's not just the punishment process, but there's the very important rehab programs which run alongside the punishment. And this part, I believe, is extremely important and actually helps the offenders to release their anger, recognise their own emotions, understand why they did the crime in the first place. And the cognitive behaviour therapy side actually prevents them from repeating the crime again in the future. And I just believe that it's important that all rehab programmes are finished, just like when we run counselling programmes with students as part of the chaplaincy team. We never leave counselling halfway, because right in the middle is when all the emotions like anger rise to the surface. And if you leave counselling procedures right in the middle, that can have detrimental effects.
And presumably, if they are released early and that rehabilitation counselling side isn't completed within prison, that doesn't continue out. They don't sort of do further work out once they've been released.
Usually no, because all the specialised programmes are all run within the prison. And usually specialist people from outside are coming in to run those programmes.
How confident are you that people can be rehabilitated? Because as we heard with Streatham, we're talking some very deep-seated beliefs from some of these people who've carried out attacks. Can they change?
The thing is, the probability of them changing would be obviously much higher if the rehab programmes are completed in the first place. So we don't know in the future if that offender will commit to the crime again, but at least we can be satisfied more if the rehab programme is completed in the first place. But if it's left incomplete, which again, is not a good thing, because the rehab programme looks into the offenders' inner selves, their emotions, helps them with their anger management, helps them deal with mental health issues, anxiety and stress. If that's not completed in the first place, then the probability is going to be higher.
There were those, Sidra, who contacted us earlier in the week saying that once you're convicted of a terror offence, you should never be released.
I think this is also a government issue, because there's lack of funds in prisons. Everybody knows there's been huge cutbacks in prisons and with the police. So, I've got lots of inside information where I've actually met judges, and they've said that they're not even allowed to sentence people, certain people, because they're told beforehand exactly how many numbers they can sentence in that year. So a lot of people are slipping through the net because of that in the first place.
So do you think the discussion around stopping the sort of early release side and effectively keeping people in prison longer, is that Is that going to work? Is that the right approach, would you say?
I think keeping them in prison would work better than what it is at the moment, because we already know last year exactly the same thing happened with the London Bridge attack in 2019, where exactly the same story, somebody was released 18 months early and then they committed the terrorist attack again.
Do we need to do more work to look at what makes people become radicalised before they get to that point, and how would you do that?
Yes, prevention is better than cure. So prevention needs to happen to begin with, but also more money needs to go into prisons to complete the rehab programmes, so that when the offender is released eventually, which their term does need to be completed, then at least they are in a better position to be able to cope with the world outside, and would have at least completed their therapy so they do not repeat the crime again.
Sidra Naeem, a chaplain at Chelmsford College, thank you for joining us this morning. Listening to that, as I mentioned, former Deputy Governor of Chelmsford Prison, Lindsay Whitehouse. Lindsay, good morning to you.
Good morning, Ben.
Just start by reacting to what Sidra's said there, some points regarding trying to prevent these terrible things happening in the future.
I agree with everything that Sidra said. In particular, prevention is better than cure. Everybody would subscribe to that. Where I take a different perspective is Sidra is quite rightly talking about rehabilitation. For the hardened terrorists, the sort of cases we're talking about, and you also referred to Usman Khan, London Bridge murderer, at the end of last year, that's much more than rehabilitation. That is about de-radicalisation. And to be honest, the de-radicalisation programme in prison is not working. And history shows that some hardened terrorists, it's almost impossible to change their mindset. And these people who are ultra-extremists, they regard themselves as martyrs on a holy mission. So it's much deeper than rehab.
The problem as well, which I've heard a lot in the discussions and the reports since that attack in Streatham on Sunday, is that in many cases when offenders are imprisoned, some of those extreme beliefs actually get worse because of the system and the way it's set up in prison. So it's actually not helping them by being in prison, because it's consolidating some of those beliefs in some way.
You're absolutely right, Sonia, sadly. But if you look at all the extreme radical terrorist attacks associated with Islam, and I say associated because they're not true Islam followers, but all of them in this country, even going back to 7/7 in 2005, they've all been committed by people whose beliefs were hardened in prison, which is staggering.
So what do the prisons need to do, and are they equipped to do that in those instances?
Okay. Yeah. Well, first, just a little bit of history as to why that's the case, because I think that's an important factor so we can go to address the problem. Back 10, 15 years ago, one individual was given oversight of the appointment of prison imams, and it was basically that person's call as to who went to prisons to act as an imam. Subsequent questioning and analysis of those imams found out that about 70% of them did not subscribe to beliefs associated with British values, which is quite a frightening figure. And further research has indicated that many of those imams completely and utterly lack the skills to deal with charismatic, hardened terrorist prisoners who put forward very strong arguments. So that's one of the reasons why prison has been a breeding ground, really, for many terrorists. If you add that to the chaos of the current prison system, it is a recipe for disaster. And again, Sidra's right, people are leaving prison without having done the appropriate programmes But as I say, it's much more than rehab. It's about de-radicalisation.
And do you think then that it can work, rehabilitation and de-radicalisation can work in prison or not?
I think it can for some individuals. I think there has to be an acceptance for some people. They are beyond the pale. Some people are so evil that it'll never work for them. So it can work, but it needs to be much better organised than it is at the moment. I did a little bit of research before the interview, and the prison service has recently identified 3 units within high security prisons to house these extreme terrorists and to deliver appropriate programs. But I understand that 2 of those units remain closed, and one of them is only full to half capacity. So the incompetence around the Ministry of Justice is part of the problem. And to be honest, that's exacerbated by a lot of the community group pressure and political scoring of smarty points by groups who seem to prioritise the needs of offenders ahead of community safety. So there's a whole raft of issues to be addressed. So it can improve, but not in its current format.
Thank you, Lindsay, for your time. Lindsay Whitehouse is the former Deputy Governor of Chelmsford Prison. Before that, you heard from Sidra Naeem, chaplain at Chelmsford College, also received training on spotting the signs of radicalisation. We're talking about the emergency legislation that's been brought in by the Justice Secretary to end the automatic early release from prison of terror offenders in the wake of the attack in Streatham on Sunday. It's very much been on the front page agenda of the newspapers this week. We heard some interesting points there from Lindsay Whitehouse, the former Deputy Governor of Chelmsford Prison. One of the things he said is that Muslim advisors were put into prisons in an attempt to de-radicalise those that were in prison. But he said 70% of the imams chosen didn't live by normal British values. Sidra Naeem, who is a chaplain at Chelmsford College and has received training on spotting the signs of radicalisation, just wants to respond to that while she's still with us in the studio. Sidra.
Yes, the reason why that is happening is that the imams are not British born to begin with, and the likelihood of someone who's born here, they are then more likely to value British values. So the imams need to be British born, and also a lot of imams are not qualified within counselling programmes. We were saying there just a moment ago when you were talking to us off the air, why is that? Why do we not have British imams going into prisons and doing this? Because the Asian community, the Muslim community, are more into making their children into doctors, dentists, professional jobs where they're paid more. Imams are quite low paid and are always privately funded through the public, the Muslim public. It's not So just finally, we were hearing, you've been talking to us for a few minutes, and obviously Lindsay came on and said this is a really complex issue with no one easy solution, but is there a worry that we haven't done enough over a period of years and we're now in a situation where it's too late to sort some of this stuff out? Do you feel quite optimistic that we may get to grips with this issue or not? I don't think it's too late. It's never too late. But I do think we need to act now. So we need to learn. And I don't think... More money, or what would be your wish list here to... Lots of things. So more money. More money is number one, definitely, because that would mean that prisoners are then kept in longer and finish their programmes properly, get more specialised programmes. But also British-born imams who are qualified within counselling. An imam is not a chaplain. There's a big difference there. So an imam will know the religion, but they may not be qualified within counselling. They're not psychotherapists. They're not psychiatrists or psychologists. Both are needed. Sidra, really interesting chatting to you. Thank you for coming in. Sidra Naeem, a chaplain at Chelmsford College. So what do you think about the discussion we've just had? Do you think people who commit terror offences, whether that be distributing material, posting something on social media, should be kept longer in prison? And I think the point we've got here is rehabilitation. Does it work
in prisons, away from terror itself, but any sort of rehabilitation? We've spoken on the show in the past about sort of reoffending rates. Come out of prison, do they ever get on the straight and narrow? Maybe you've gone through it, or you've got a loved one who's gone through it, or a friend, somebody you know. Does rehabilitation work in prisons?
With regards to terrorism, what do you think needs to happen? We're hearing about talk of getting rid of this system of early release, so offenders are spending longer in prison, but we're also hearing that in many cases some already extreme views are hardened because offenders are spending time in prison. So what is the answer here? Quite a complex problem. There won't just be one easy solution, but any thoughts you want to share with us, 0800 111 40 41. And if you do want to talk about the wider issue of rehabilitating offenders, not necessarily for something as serious as terrorism, what kind of work is done in prisons if you yourself have spent time inside for an offence? What sort of work is done with regards to rehabilitation? Is it sufficient enough, and does it work?